For joining. My name is Dustin Thompson. I'm the director for the Sierra Club Delaware chapter. Sierra Club is statewide. The Delaware Sierra Club is a statewide organization, but I am centered here in Wilmington in the Ellesmere area. The Delaware chapter, so the Sierra Club, taking a step back, for those that don't know and are new, the Sierra Club is actually the nation's oldest environmental advocacy group. Here in Delaware, we've been around since the 70s, but we formally became a chapter in the 90s, branching out from what used to be the Potomac chapter or group, and that got divided up in Maryland and Delaware and parts of Virginia. So we've been around for a little bit. Every chapter works on different issues based on sort of what the needs are in the communities that we serve. Here in Delaware, we primarily focus around climate, energy, and environmental justice policy. We do work in the conservation space, but it's a lot of it's kind of a supporting role to a lot of the really great conservation organizations that exist in Delaware, of which there are a lot. And so we don't, buy land or manage land or anything like that, but we do outings and events and hikes and bikes, and we've did our first camping this year, and we're doing a couple of camping trips next year that you'll hear about in January that we're still hammering out some details on. So we do that kind of, outdoorsy stuff that most Sierra Club, folks are familiar with. But a lot of our work in terms of staff power is dedicated in the energy policy space and making sure we're focusing on environmental justice and all the things that we do in that space. And so just as a way of an example, we helped increase the state's commitment to renewable energy several years ago, worked through establishing a community solar program in Delaware. That rolled right into passing the Climate Change Solutions Act, which set greenhouse gas emissions for the state. One of the last states in the region to do that, but it is one of the strongest goals in the region. So, we'll take that. And then this past year, we worked on legislation around offshore wind. We also work on issues around cumulative impacts that we've been working on legislation with communities across the state for a number of years. And we're hoping to continue that work moving into next year. Not hoping, we will be continuing that work moving into next year. And so tonight, what we're going to talk about, though, we're going to start out talking about hydrogen. And I'm going to introduce our first speaker in a second. But essentially what we're hoping to do is set like a 101 level or maybe 99 level of hydrogen, because it's an issue that's coming up more and more in Delaware. So a lot of folks don't know because it never really made the limelight, so to speak. But there's been legislation that we have actually pushed back on that, it's really sort of a very expensive greenwashing project around what so-called low carbon fuels, and hydrogen's usually included in that, but as is biogas and or renewable natural gas, whatever you want to call it, and even carbon dioxide, and using these, injecting these into our pipelines that feed our homes, and actually charging ratepayers the costs of all of the investments in producing, transporting, and distributing those gases, and they're very expensive. And they don't actually help us meet our climate goals when they're used in this way. And so, what we're hoping to do is sort of get some conversation going and some base knowledge going about, why we push back on certain things around hydrogen and are not as pushing back on other fronts, because there's a lot of nuance around hydrogen, and we wanted to sort of have that conversation tonight. Because not all hydrogen's created the same. It's not all used the same. It doesn't all have sort of the same impact. And so we're very lucky to have Patrick join us tonight. And I realize that I'm not sharing my screen, so you guys are sort of seeing all this. So let me do that real quick here. All right, there we go. So we got that. All right, so we're gonna hear from Patrick. We're gonna do a Q&A and give Patrick some time to answer what I'm sure will be some great questions. And then we'll have a speaker from the Center for Clean Hydrogen that's working on a really exciting green hydrogen project here in Delaware. We're going to hear from Marissa, who's our other staff member at the Sierra Club, who's been engaging. She's our environmental justice organizer, and she's been engaging with the Mach 2 Hydrogen Hub. So she's going to give an update on that work. I'm going to then take it back over and sort of talk about where we are in terms of clean energy on a number of different fronts, and then where we see the sort of path ahead with the incoming administrative change on the federal and the state levels. We'll touch on both of those a little bit. So the Sierra Club, in our work that we do, we're on a number of different task force, and we've covered some of the legislative stuff that we've done, but you're going to hear some of these things mentioned throughout the presentation. So it just sort of bears mentioning now. We do serve on the Renewable Energy Task Force, which helps advise around solar policies and renewable energy policies, and you'll hear them in sort of their component of other policies around wind, for example. We served on the Governor's Energy Advisory Council. We still have a seat on that. We've served on Senator Hansen's Energy Stakeholders Group, which does a lot of legislative policy work around energy policy. And then we're also serving on Governor-elect Meyer's transition committee on sustainable systems and resilient communities. And those are public meetings. The first one's tomorrow night. If you haven't heard it, you can find it on Matt's Facebook page and on his landing page. And then we've also done a lot of regulatory work, and we have work ahead of us around solar and how we get more solar in Delaware. And I'm not going to go into the details, but just to say we do a lot of different levels of energy policy work here in Delaware. So Patrick here is our Director of Climate Policy and Advocacy for the National Sierra Club. It's based in DC, and he leads a whole team of folks that work on issues around clean energy, climate change, building electrification, decarbonization, just a whole host of issues. So we're very lucky that we were able to pluck him away from all of that work for a little bit to join us tonight. So that being said, I'm going to kick it over to Patrick so he can give us sort of a one-on-one. So if you have questions, sorry, Patrick, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat at any time. And we'll try to sort of work them in as we go through. There will be a question and answer opportunity where you can come off mute if you don't want to type in. But no, again, we are recording tonight. We haven't committed to posting the full thing on YouTube, but just know if you come off of mute to ask your question, and you'll do that by raising your hand, and I'll get you to unmute, that you're going to show up on the recording. So just know that. And if you start to pontificate instead of ask your question, I will cut you off. Ask your question. There's a lot of folks here tonight. I want to make sure everybody gets their questions answered. So, sorry, Patrick, I will stop sharing and turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Dustin. Let me share my screen here quick. Hi, everyone. It's great to see everyone, and let me just get it full screen. Cool. We're full screen.
It shot back to your desktop, actually.
Oh no. Oh gosh. All right. Maybe this one works.
There you go.
Good. Okay. Cool. If I look away from the camera, it's because I'm looking at my other screen to see the presentation. But yeah, thanks, Dustin, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Really nice to see you all, and thanks for joining this evening. For this. My name's Pat Drupp. As Dustin said, I'm the Director of Climate Policy and Advocacy for the National Sierra Club. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I'm part of the federal lobbyist team. My team works on many different issues, but specifically on decarbonization of the energy, industrial and transportation sectors. So hydrogen is something I've been working on for probably almost 5 years at this point. I looked back recently to the first time I ever sent. I've worked at Sierra Club 5 years this month, and I looked back recently for the first time I ever mentioned hydrogen in an email that I sent, and it was actually in January of 2020. So almost 5 years ago that this first really started coming up on my radar, and has really kind of exploded in the past couple of years because there's a huge amount of money involved. So folks can see here, hydrogen hoopla. I like alliteration. There's going to be a lot of it. It's a little corny. I apologize in advance, but I think it sticks in people's heads. So I wanted to start off really tonight and give you guys to level set. I don't know what everyone's knowledge base on hydrogen is. There's a lot of different stuff. There's how you make it, there's how you use it, and everything in between. So I want to give a little bit of that and what Sierra Club's perspective on that is, why we're in the situation where we're even talking about this tonight, and maybe what you all can do from the Delaware perspective moving forward to ensure that like your state works on hydrogen in the correct way and doesn't let it become a distraction from the clean energy transition. So I like to start with a couple of things that I hope that you all will take away from this. So kind of the conclusions at the beginning in what I kind of call hope, hype, and hazards, where you'll hear that hydrogen is a hope for a lot of different things. It's got a potential to play a role in so many different parts of decarbonization. You may have heard if you've been involved in this. And so we see hydrogen as a potential to play a very important role in reducing emissions in some difficult to decarbonize sectors of the economy, where electrification and other alternatives don't really exist, or they're not necessarily a great viable option. We're going to get into that more in a minute. But there's also a lot of hype around hydrogen, in that it's not always the best solution in every scenario, in every sector, especially when something like a direct electrification option already exists. Because hydrogen, we'll talk about, might not be the most efficient, it might not be the cheapest, and it may actually slow rather than speed up our efforts to transition to a clean energy economy. And then there's also not just that hype of like, yeah, it might not be the best solution, but there's also some hazards. There's some real dangers of embracing it in the wrong way and really incentivizing and encouraging the wrong types of hydrogen production. And if we don't do this very carefully, Dustin said it's nuanced. It's extremely nuanced. It can be a potential lifeline to the gas industry and the fossil fuel industry. And that's partly why it's become such a big deal, because they've put money behind it to really hype it up, along with like the plastics industry. Hydrogen's like a thing that can keep the gas and the oil industry going as we try and transition away from them and off of fossil fuels. And even green hydrogen, we're going to define that in a minute, but even that has the potential to really derail some of our clean energy goals and affect what we're trying to do in this transition and actually increase emissions. So there's some good opportunity, there's hope, there's some not great ideas, there's hype, and then there's some real hazards if we're not careful about how we approach hydrogen. And some of you may be familiar with hydrogen. It's been touted as like this miracle molecule, that it's got, this graphic has appeared online as the Swiss Army knife of decarbonization. It's got options for dealing with aviation, with fertilizer, with chemicals, with industrial processes, steel making, buildings, heat, power generation, trucks, trains, you name it. Hydrogen has probably been touted as a potential solution for decarbonizing and getting us off fossil fuels. But the thing, you're all Sierra Club members, so you're familiar with Swiss Army knives. And the reality is that a Swiss Army knife is a tool that can do a lot of different things, but it's never the best tool for the job. And so I want people to keep that in mind. While there may be 40 different applications where hydrogen may work, it's not necessarily the best application of our time and our resources moving forward. So why are we here? Why am I even talking to you tonight about hydrogen? And we're here because there's a huge amount of federal money in the past couple of years that has been thrown in the direction of hydrogen without a lot of guardrails to make sure that it's done in a way that Sierra Club would consider acceptable and safe towards our clean energy future. The first of those things that happened federally was that in the end of 2021, Congress passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Many of you have probably heard of it, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This created, it forced the Department of Energy to make a roadmap for the United States clean hydrogen future. There's some numbers on this slide, but really the point was that they wanted us to quintuple the amount of hydrogen that the US is making currently, but in a clean way, by the year 2050. A huge, huge increase. They committed $8 billion to a program called the Hydrogen Hubs, which many of you might be familiar with because Delaware is intimately involved in a hydrogen hub project, along with Pennsylvania and Maryland, the Mach 2 hub, the Mid-Atlantic Clean Hydrogen Hub. And so they set the groundwork in the infrastructure law. And then a year later, when the Inflation Reduction Act, or the Biden's Clean Energy Plan, was passed, there was a huge incentive to create hydrogen on a per kilogram basis. It's actually the most lucrative tax credit in the entire Inflation Reduction Act on a per energy basis, and could be worth as much as $30 billion a year. So there's a lot of money out there. And like I said, there's a lot of fossil interests involved. There's a lot of new interests involved. And so people have a lot of equity locked up in trying to make a massive hydrogen industry. And Sierra Club's position has more been like, we might be able to grow this in a way that makes it very useful in certain niche applications, but maybe we don't need like this massive, massive build out of infrastructure and hydrogen. So I wanted to talk briefly about how hydrogen is produced, because this is kind of the first of two really main points for how you should be like evaluating a project and a hydrogen project going forward. You may have heard colors of hydrogen. I don't know. I was going to say, if people have heard of a color of hydrogen, like just raise your hand virtually. Only a couple of people are on camera, but you may have heard of this, all of these different colors of hydrogen. And we're not going to go through this chart entirely, but right now, most of hydrogen that is produced is what's called gray hydrogen. We make a certain amount of it, and it's tied very closely to the petrochemical industry and oil refining. And that's been the primary use of hydrogen in the US, throughout our history. Another one, then we've got blue hydrogen, turquoise hydrogen, black, brown, green, yellow, pink, all of these different methods. And one of the things that I think is a problem is that it kind of obfuscates how hydrogen is actually made. And so people get really caught up in the colors, but I'm just putting it out there so you know, there's all these different things, and they're all different types. But we're going to drill in on what all of this, kind of really means. Oh, I forgot there was a GIF of a rainbow unicorn here, because hydrogen is touted as this unicorn solution. So a bunch of these, you can see on the left-hand side of that slide, the gray, blue, turquoise, brown, they're all based on fossil fuels still, even though they're this clean energy solution. Traditional hydrogen is made from gas. And all of these other variations of it are still made from gas, even if they're being touted as a cleaner solution. There's a couple that are made from renewable energy. And then you've got like pink, red, and purple, which are made from nuclear power, which is a big deal for the hub that's being proposed and being built out in Delaware. And the ones I really wanted to focus on tonight, though, are gray, blue, and green. Gray is the way that we have always made hydrogen. It's the way that 95% of hydrogen in the US is currently made. You take natural gas, you hit it with a whole bunch of steam, it breaks the gas up chemically, and you're left with hydrogen. We make about 10 million metric tons per year, and almost all of it is made next to a plastics facility or a chemicals facility or an oil refinery, and almost all of it goes straight into that. It's super emissions intensive. It releases a lot of carbon dioxide. When you blast gas with steam, you create carbon dioxide and you create hydrogen. Those are your two products that you get. So it's very emissions intensive process. Blue hydrogen, which many of you have probably heard, is the same process, just with carbon capture, a solution that we don't really think is the best way, because it perpetuates the fossil fuel industry, and we don't really know how much carbon can actually be captured out of this process. And the third one that many people have probably heard of is what's called green hydrogen. And this is really, from Sierra Club's perspective, probably the only way that we could support a hydrogen project if it's made with green hydrogen. And this is, you take water, which is H2O, you hit it with an electrical current, it splits into oxygen and hydrogen, and you harvest the hydrogen. There's no emissions involved, but it is incredibly energy intensive. And so if it's powered by something other than renewables, it actually just leads to other emissions problems. But if it's powered by renewables, you can essentially create zero carbon hydrogen with no emissions. What you do with it's another story that we'll get to in a few minutes. Currently, this is just a map showing where hydrogen's made. Again, we make about 10 million metric tons. The United States Department of Energy said that by 2050, we need to make 50 million metric tons of clean hydrogen, so 5 times the amount that we currently make. Right now, you look along there on this map, you can see a lot of it centered around the Gulf Coast, where most of our petrochemical industry is centered. A few other places where there's oil refineries and other chemical feedstocks. So this is what we have to decarbonize first, and then we have to think about what a good use of hydrogen might be moving forward. So I wanted to talk about green hydrogen. Justin and Marissa kind of asked that we talk about some of the guardrails and things that we can consider, because just making hydrogen in this green way, as green hydrogen, does not mean that it's like a perfect solution. It doesn't necessarily safeguard you from a whole lot of problems. So again, you hit water with an electrical current, you split it into hydrogen and oxygen, and then you harvest the hydrogen. This is ostensibly powered by renewables, but the thing is, it's incredibly energy intensive. Down there at the bottom, it says it takes 55 kilowatt hours of electricity to make 1 kilogram of hydrogen. To put that in perspective, that's about 2 days of energy for the average US household to make 1 kilogram of hydrogen. The goal is to make like 50 million metric tons of hydrogen. That is a massive amount of electricity that far exceeds the amount of renewables that we currently have on the grid. Even if you diverted every electron from the wind, solar, and battery storage that we currently make. So you can see why this could become a problem very quickly. Because if you divert that existing renewable energy to make hydrogen, what happens? You just backfill with coal or with gas, and you've just created more emissions for the grid. So that's why I have to be very, very careful. And so one of the things that the environmental community and Sierra Club have really pushed for is that any green hydrogen needs to be created under what's called the 3 pillars. We're not going to get too deep in the weeds here, I promise. But the 3 pillars are guardrails around how you make hydrogen. 1, you want it to be made with additional or newly built clean energy. If we're diverting existing resources, all you're doing is increasing emissions because some other fossil asset has to come on to make up the difference. You want it to be regional or deliverable, which means we're trying to make the hydrogen near where we're using it and where it's getting its electricity from. That reduces the amount of emissions in the process. And you want it what's called hourly time matched, which means that when the clean energy is being produced, that's when hydrogen's being made. We're not just like buying and selling offsets and all kinds of stuff that creates different sorts of shenanigans and can actually lead to different emissions in different places on the grid. If you don't meet these 3 things, you're going to increase emissions. And that's the thing that I really want people to understand, is that green hydrogen, even though it's made with renewables, even though there's no emissions where you're producing it, can lead to emissions somewhere else on the grid if you don't very strictly follow these guardrails. And we've been pushing very hard that hydrogen that gets a federal incentive, that gets a tax credit, needs to meet these criteria, or else it's not actually doing the job of reducing emissions across the grid as it's claiming to. And so I will just say, from the production standpoint, Sierra Club can potentially support green hydrogen projects if they meet those different criteria that I just named. That's the only way that we're looking at potentially supporting a project. The other side of that is not just how you make hydrogen, but what you do with it, what its end use is. It's, like I said, it's been put out there to decarbonize all sorts of different things. But what it's got its most promise for is decarbonizing certain industrial applications, things where really high heat is required that we can't create with electricity alone, steel making, where it can replace coal, chemical feedstocks, fertilizers that rely on hydrogen as a feedstock. It might be able to be used to make fuels for aviation, for long shipping, and potentially for energy storage. But all of those things come with caveats. Like I mentioned on that previous slide, one of the things where there's potentially hope for hydrogen is in industrial processes, and especially in the steel making process. Not making a lot of steel in Delaware, but Pennsylvania is also really looking at hydrogen to potentially decarbonize its steel industry. A few years ago, Sweden created the first fossil-free steel. No coal used whatsoever, no gas used. And they used hydrogen to do that in replacement of what the coal does in like a chemical process. You can use hydrogen for that. But again, that really only works if the hydrogen was created in that clean process that I described earlier. Otherwise, you're just going to create emissions overall. So possible applications in industry. In the building sector, many people have probably, you may have heard of this because the gas industry really wants to talk about blending hydrogen into the existing gas system. So if you've got a gas furnace, gas hot water heater, gas stove in your house, as many people do in the Northeast, they've talked about this is a way we can decarbonize that gas system by pumping some hydrogen in there, because hydrogen burns with no emissions, no carbon emissions, I should say, that would decarbonize the grid and decarbonize the gas system. In reality, that is a terrible idea. Once you introduce more than like 30% hydrogen into the gas system, you need to tear out all the pipes. You need to replace every appliance. That's incredibly expensive when people could just install heat pumps, which are far more efficient than combustion in the first place. So this slide is from a great report by Earth Justice, one of our partners in this, kind of showing by the time you go through all the stages of making your hydrogen, you're at like 62% efficiency. A heat pump is like 3 to 5 times more efficient than that right off the bat. And you don't have all of the dangers. You don't have to, worry about all of the green hydrogen production like I just described. You're just installing a heat pump. In vehicles, you've probably also heard hydrogen for vehicles, and this is something that Donald Trump has actually talked quite a bit about as a bad idea. An electric vehicle is far more efficient than making hydrogen, putting it into a vehicle, and combusting it or running it through a fuel cell. By that point, you've reduced your efficiency by 25 to 30% from your initial standpoint. You've got energy loss every step of the process. Creating hydrogen is energy intensive. You have to compress it. You have to liquefy it. You have to transport it somewhere. You have to have rebuilt the entire, gas system, gasoline system in the US to be able to pump out hydrogen. And then you have efficiency losses as you use it through fuel cells or combust it. Whereas an EV is 70, 90% efficient right off the bat. So it kind of doesn't make any sense in like light duty vehicles because there's all sorts of these problems along the way. And then, so this is kind of a summary of these various end uses. And the reason these 4 end uses are picked is because the Hydrogen Hubs program that Congress created a couple of years ago said we need to make hubs that focus on each one of these 4 end uses, buildings. We don't think that's a good option at all. Electrification makes way more sense. It's cheaper, it's more energy efficient, it will reduce emissions better. In the electric sector, we don't really think it's a great idea to use hydrogen to make electricity. You're using renewables to make hydrogen to make power, when you could have just used the renewables to make power in the first place. It may have a little bit of potential for a long-term storage option that's very geographically dependent. In the transportation sector, it doesn't really make sense. Electricity and electrification, EVs, better option. And then in the industrial sector, if electrification is possible, that's going to be cheaper and it's going to be more efficient. If it's not possible, that's where hydrogen becomes a potential option for decarbonization. Like I mentioned, in steel, certain chemicals, certain, fertilizer, things like that. Hydrogen hubbub. What's the hubbub about hydrogen? So like I mentioned, the Hydrogen Hub program, which the Delaware chapter is deeply involved in because of this Mach 2 hub that's being proposed in Delaware, was a program that was created in the Infrastructure Act a couple of years ago. It's $8 billion of funding. And they said you have to make hubs that are making hydrogen from natural gas, from nuclear, and from renewables, and they have to focus on those different end uses that I just talked about. So that's kind of like where the incentive was for this hub. The Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland hub was one of 9 finalists that actually was receiving funding from the Department of Energy after about 15 or so projects applied. The hydrogen hub is considered a whole bunch of things, from the energy source used to make hydrogen to the hydrogen production itself, to the distribution, the transportation of hydrogen, and ultimately its end use. So there's all of these different things, that kind of entities that are part of this big hub that's one big public-private partnership. And so that takes different form depending on where you are. Primarily nuclear power and renewable energy is what's being proposed for making hydrogen in Delaware. And I've heard all of the different end uses, from power generation to transportation to industrial decarbonization. This is just a map showing the awardees, who else got the hub money. There were 2 in Pennsylvania, 1 in California, 1 in the Pacific Northwest. The one that really matters to you all is that Mid-Atlantic Clean Hydrogen Hub, the number 5 on this chart. And again, you can see the number is in green and red, meaning that it's focused on hydrogen that's created from nuclear power and from renewable energy. And so this is really my last slide, and then I'll stop and take questions. One of the things we got a lot was what should we be looking for in a hub? What makes what kind of questions should we be asking as we're going through community benefits agreements and all of the different processes and engagement that these hubs are supposed to be undergoing? I will say there hasn't been nearly as much transparency with the Department of Energy as there should be. It's been a fight. We've been trying, but we haven't been getting nearly as much information as we'd like. But these are some questions you can kind of ask, does the project primarily rely on green hydrogen? Is it green hydrogen that's made with that 3 pillars compliant, where it's meeting all of the requirements to make sure that emissions are not going to increase? Is producing green hydrogen actually necessary? Or is there some other alternative? Could you just electrify it directly? Does the use of hydrogen preclude meeting energy needs through a lower emissions or low cost pathway? Is it being produced on site? Hydrogen's very difficult to transport. If you have to transport it a long distance, either via truck or ship or pipeline, you're losing a huge amount of energy in that process. You're increasing dangers for communities, and you're risking more emissions in the process. And finally, is the project proposing to blend green hydrogen into gas, which is really just a giant greenwashing scheme by the gas industry. So anytime you hear like, we're going to blend this into the existing system, that should be an immediate red flag about any sort of project. If you blend 30% hydrogen into a gas system, you've decreased emissions about 12% overall. You need to get, and once you, and I picked 30%, that's not arbitrary because most systems, appliances, pipelines, whatever, can't handle more than 30% before you have to change all of the infrastructure. So if you're hearing people saying, don't worry, in 10 years, we're just gonna be 100% hydrogen. They're gonna have had to replace everything. The pipes, the pipelines, the small pipes that distribute gas to your homes, the appliances in your homes. So be very wary of that. Just some key takeaways here. Again, green hydrogen can play an important role in decarbonizing certain sectors where there are no other options that currently exist. But it has to be produced in a very specific way with a lot of guardrails. Otherwise, you will increase emissions. Blue hydrogen, which really isn't a threat in Delaware, but it's always good to keep it on your radar, is just an extension and expansion of the fossil fuel industry. It is not a climate solution, period. And for potential end uses, industrial, shipping, aviation, storage are possible options. We have intentionally not created a very restrictive Sierra Club policy because these things need to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. We need communities to be have the flexibility that they need to decide whether this is the right option for them or not, including the emissions factors, including environmental justice factors, including safety and other sorts of things there. Wasteful end uses, again, if you hear it's going to be used in buildings, if you hear it's going to be burned in a power plant, you hear it's going to be used in vehicles, these are bad options. We have better solutions that already exist. So with that, I'm going to stop. I hope that was helpful. I hope it was useful. And I think there's a little bit of time for questions. I know that was a lot of information, so I'm happy to try and answer anything.
Yeah. So again, if you, so just a couple caveats. You can put questions in the chat. We can read those out for you. And I see there is one question already, so we'll get to that in a second. So if you have a question and you want to ask that yourself, just know that if we do share the recording, you will be on. And that if you pontificate for more than 30 seconds, I will cut you off. So if folks want to, I see we have one person raising their hand, and I believe, Ken, yours was the question I was going to read out loud. So if you want to come off mute, let me just find you here real quick. There you are. So you should get a pop-up saying that you can unmute. Yeah, there you go. So go ahead.
Yeah, great, thanks. Okay, I'll try to be real brief. So there was a study done by Columbia, and this was substantiated by others, that when hydrogen escapes, and it escapes, like 3 times the rate of methane, because it's such a small molecule, that it prolongs the life of methane in the atmosphere, which usually has a 10 or 15-year lifetime. And so somebody calculated that therefore the global warming potential of hydrogen when it escapes is like 100 over 10 years. So it's as bad as methane from that standpoint. And pipelines and storage facilities don't get better over time. So I mean, this is terrible. If nothing else, it's going to make climate change worse just because of the release of all this additional hydrogen in the atmosphere that we wouldn't have. It's also very water intensive to make green hydrogen, and the price is totally out of the range of anybody using it effectively right now. And I think all these companies are going after this, not only to substantiate the infrastructure that's already there, but the fact that the government put $7 billion up is really why there's all this excitement. People just want to get that money, not necessarily decarbonize. So thank you for the time.
No, 100%. And you covered 2 important things that I didn't really mention, which is water use And also the fact that hydrogen, when it does escape, can be a short-term greenhouse gas with a pretty major impact, which is partly why folks have talked about, if you're going to make hydrogen, you need to make it right near where you're going to use it, because the farther you have to transport it, every mile you have to transport it, there's more and more that escapes. Yeah, great points.
Yeah, and I saw Karen just answered your question, Amy, in the chat. So hopefully that helps. If it doesn't, then you can sort of add on to your question. But I think Karen answered it pretty good in the chat there. So we have Cora, and yeah, Patrick. I sort of use the analogy. You know, right now we mess around with like carbon and methane, which are molecules wise fairly large. So it's like we're messing around with semi trucks, and we are having a hard time containing them. And now we're talking about messing around with grains of sand. You know, so it's it is tough. So Cora, you should get a pop-up there.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you for that presentation. That was very informative. So I have two questions. The first is, are any of the proposed hubs actually in production? If so, is there any sort of like information, metrics, actual information about the energy utilization versus expense versus transportation and distribution and various usage, or is every single hub at this point effectively vaporware?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think any are actually producing. I see someone respond in the chat. There are small projects around the country that are producing small amounts, very small amounts, like tons, not million ton, not metric, you know, just small amounts of hydrogen. So like, yeah, we're not at the phase where this is ready to go at all. Part of that is many of those hubs have been waiting around for the Department of Treasury to release guidance on whether or not they qualify for the tax credit. And these hubs are really only economic if they also not only take their hubs money from the Department of Energy, but if they qualify for this very lucrative tax credit that's based on a per kilogram basis of their production. We have been waiting for that guidance for over 2 years. It's not out yet. And that is one of the huge question marks of an incoming Trump administration, is we have really no idea what's going to happen with that. Likely, they will try and dirty it up and make it so that make it a little more simpler, and make it that rather than how clean you are determines how much money you get, but make it like kind of all hydrogen gets a certain amount of money somewhere in the middle. But most of them haven't come up yet because they're really all just sitting around waiting whether they're going to get this huge billion-dollar federal subsidy or not, which is what they need to be economic, because as somebody, whoever was just speaking, said, wildly expensive, period. And so that's the situation we're in.
We're gonna do 2 more questions. I do want to bring this one in from Amy. Patrick, I don't know if you're in this side of the policy side, so would love to hear the question. So Amy asks, does the coming projected energy demand increase from AI data centers change this analysis at all? What's the thinking on that line? It's something we're dealing with a lot here in the PJM footprint. So I would love to, it's a great question.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's something that like we're trying to work out. There's for the first time in 25 years, electricity use in the United States, electricity demand in the US is increasing. That's, you know, data centers, AI, cryptocurrency, somebody put in the chat, you know, and potentially hydrogen. So it's a huge part of, if we really were to scale it up the way that the goals are set out there for, it is a huge part of like this quote unquote load growth story that we're dealing with. And that's why I said, like, if you are going to make green hydrogen, you've got to follow those 3 pillars where you're bringing on new clean energy, new renewable energy specifically for that project. Because if it was otherwise going to go power a home, you're just diverting it away, and you're going to fill that with coal or gas. And when you start doing the numbers of what that actually equals out to, it's worse than just burning gas in the first place on its own, rather than making hydrogen and doing whatever your situation is. So hydrogen is absolutely part of this like load growth energy demand story that we're gonna really have to wrap our heads around how we handle this huge increase as we're trying to build out in the transition.
Yeah, and so just for folks that are interested on that, there is a Demanding Better report that Sierra Club was a part of that looks at, you know, what we're looking for when it comes to AI and data centers. Data centers, you know, we're using it right now, right? We're using data centers right now. We're all on Zoom, right? So it's Zoom, it's streaming services, it's online gaming. I mean, you name it nowadays, right? And we're using data centers. So it's not a genie that's likely to go back in the bottle, but efficiency will improve over time as chips become better and electronics become more efficient. But we've really put the cart ahead of the horse on this one. And so Sierra Club is part of an effort to look at what can we do? Yeah, thank you. What can we do as we grow data centers? And Marissa just put the link in the chat. What are we going to do as we grow data centers to make sure that we're demanding better from them as we grow in that way? So like on-site renewable generation, commitment to clean energy procurement, that sort of thing. There's a lot of stuff in the report. If you're interested in that, I would encourage you to check it out. So we're going to go to one more question. We're going to get to John. Before I unmute John, I will say, you know, hopefully Patrick can stick around for a few more minutes and folks can put their questions in the chat, and then, you know, Patrick might be able to chime in as I'm sorry, is it Dr. Medlinger? I hope I'm pronouncing that right or close. Is doing their presentation. So if we didn't get to your question, if you could pop it in the chat, but I'm going to let John ask his question, and then we're going to move into the next speaker so we can respect everybody's time.
Okay, just wanted to know if you wanted to say any more about the safety issues. You know, it seems like in terms of environmental justice implications, anything you'd add?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just say that anywhere that you're going to make hydrogen, you probably need to store it unless you're using it immediately. There's all sorts of different plans for storing it. And then there's also all these plans for building huge networks of pipelines. And all of those things come with the danger of leakage. They come with other, you know, I think we use hydrogen now in part of our economy already. It's certainly a hazardous material and it can be dangerous, but like we mostly know how to store it, but it's still expensive to do that. And it's energy intensive every time you have to like compress it down and store it cryogenically and then, release it back. And so like, there's certainly an environmental justice angle here that you could have, you know, infrastructure in communities, more infrastructure in communities that we don't want. And so that's why I think, you know, we've really tried to leave it to like on a really case-by-case basis to evaluate whether these things are being addressed. But the safety hazard of storing and transporting it really absolutely should not be overlooked. We know how to do it, but it is still very much an important piece of the puzzle when evaluating any project.
Yeah, there was a study, it might have been the one that Ken was referencing. It was first published in Nature magazine that really went into really great detail, you know, expectations, pluses and minuses, expectations around hydrogen. And they got into sort of the leakage and what could be acceptable on an economic standpoint, but damaging on a climate standpoint, like economically for the industry, but damaging on the climate. It's a really interesting, extremely dense report, but a really interesting one. So now